Welcome to today's webinar, Monitoring as Code. We're glad you could join us. The event will start shortly. Next slide. Today's webinar will be brought to you by your Application Performance Management Special Interest Group. Your SIG leaders for this event will be myself, Ron Franklin, and Rocky Pisto. Rocky, would you have a few words you'd like to say?
Yeah, it's great that we can actually pull off something right now during this COVID period. So I think everyone's going to enjoy this presentation today. It's something a little different. So look forward to it.
I know I'm excited to hear this. This is a relevant topic for today's IT environment. So next slide. So as you heard, myself, Ron Franklin, will be today's moderator. And I welcome you to our today's webinar. Next slide. And today's speakers will be Lars Rossen. Lars, would you happen to have a few words to say?
Well, sure. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk about this topic today. It's an area that is pretty hot in the market, and so looking forward to present that. And as you can see, I've been with Micro Focus. Well, you can't see it here, but I've been with Micro Focus for a long time. I'm in the CTO office and work sort of across the entire portfolio as the chief architect for the organization.
Thank you. And Michael Procopio, Product Marketing Manager for OpsBridge for Micro Focus. Michael, would you have a few words to say?
Sure. I'm excited to present, and this is one of the few presentations that I get to do that actually crosses various Micro Focus products, and so I'm excited to be able to bring that together.
Thank you. Now, next slide, please. Just a couple of housekeeping events. Here, this will be a live session and is being recorded, and recordings are available for all Vivit members. There will be a session question and answer, so please type any questions in the question pane, and we'll answer them at the end of this presentation. Next slide. So for your webinar control panel, you can toggle view window between full screen and window mode. Just enter your questions down there at the bottom as you see. Next question. And Lars, I'm going to turn this over to you. Lars, take it away.
Thank you. So the agenda today is pretty simple. What is monitoring as code? How does it fit with the concept of DevOps? And I would be talking about those two topics. And then I'll hand it over to Michael that would talk about how to actually implement this using our products in a scalable DevOps way. That is actually a pretty important part of it. So that's simple. Let's dive in. So what is monitoring as code? Well, it's pretty simple, actually, right? And I'm dumbing it down on purpose because it actually turns out that there are some finer pointers that is important to talk about when we have it as this big picture. So IT fundamentally split into two parts in 90% of the cases: the part where someone develops bits and the other parts where someone runs the bits, right? And those two things shall never come together, right? Is almost a rule. Surely we're trying to break it down, but come to that. Monitoring, well, that's to make sure that the bits are running stable. You know what's going on, hopefully in a predictive manner, and so you can take corrective action if something goes wrong. No special things around that part. Monitoring as code, well, that's really to think about, well, couldn't we get the people that makes the bits also to define how to monitor the bits? Because at the end of the day, they probably know more about it than anybody else. And when they define how to monitor the bits, maybe they can even code that so that the monitoring itself becomes bits or code, if you will. So that's simple, right? It's also what some people call a shift left activity, in the sense of developers sitting to the left of the operations in org charts, and then you're moving activities around, figuring out how to monitor from the operations organization left into the development organization. Okay, so how does it fit with DevOps? Well, it's almost natural with what I just said, but let's explain it a little bit. First, definition of DevOps, and I assume most of you have heard it. Probably a number of you on the call today is also implementing various forms of DevOps, but fundamentally, it's the practice of combining software development, dev, with IT operations, ops, right? So this is the infinity sign with dev and ops next to each other. That's where we are going towards. That's very nice. Now, I do believe that DevOps is really a cover for development to take over the world and really handcuff the rest of the organization into them being in control. And you can quote me for saying that, yes. Now, maybe they're not doing it for nefarious purposes, right? In many ways, developers are pretty smart guys, and there is an enormous pressure on the digital business and the IT organization to have speed, and dev is all about change and doing new things and trying stuff out, where operations is all about stability. So don't change too much, right? So it's in a conflict, and by giving developers more power, you get more speed, potentially, right? But why couldn't they just work with ops? Well, because they think it's easier to do themselves and they believe they're smart, right? We'll come to that. Because one of the issues is that, unfortunately, the typical dev organization, the typical individual developer or development team, they don't really understand what it means to do operations at enterprise scale. They can understand their own little product, but when it comes into the bigger scheme of things, it breaks down. So really, are developers that bad? Well, actually, if I look into many big enterprise organizations, and in my role, I do get a chance to actually do that. I go out and work with a lot of CTOs and technology leaders in a number of our customer organizations. And I also looked into our own development organization, for the matter. And we see that every product team, typically when they want to be agile, not DevOps, just agile, right? They build up these tool chains that makes it very efficient to do the things they need to do. But every team picks their own tool chain. And they do it based on legacy, based on not invented here, based on this looks cool, so let's try it out. As you know, developers, they like to try new stuff. That's part of their DNA. So that's what you end up having. Now, if you then ask the developers to also then do the monitoring side of the application, please push your product into production and start monitoring and manage that. Then you add a couple of columns more to the concept. They're not only then disagreeing on what source code control system to do, what kind of continuous testing tools to do, what kind of development agile management tools to use, but they will all develop different kinds of configuration management solutions. They would choose different monitoring tools, and the way they would then handle the incident that comes out of it would be also pretty different. One team might go directly back to the backlog, defect logs in their development cycle. Others will do a proper incident management. Some people don't really have a clue. They're monitoring, looking at the logs, and then see if something goes wrong. So it very quickly becomes chaotic. And again, that's actually what we see out there. DevOps teams, so we see organizations, they say, okay, yeah, we need to be DevOps. That's a buzzword. We're going to do it with the new kits. So new mobile apps needs to be developed. Let's do it in a DevOps manner. And they get full autonomy to get speed. And once you have 10 DevOps teams, they have developed 10 different ways of doing stuff in operations. Not good. So can we address that? Can we do something about that? Well, yes, there are ways of doing it. And one of the things that we have been working in Micro Focus on quite a lot is to create such a unifying architecture that can underpin it all, so that all of these assorted set of tools can actually be much more concentrated down into something coherent. it's an open composable architecture. So it's not to say that you have to buy all kinds of Micro Focus products and then you are golden. We do think that that would be a good idea, of course, but we know and we recognize that for some of the boxes, you have already chosen some good tools that might not be Micro Focus, but despair not, it's an open architecture, so you can mix and match various vendors' products, but you can still, in each of the boxes, trying to nail down what are you going to do there. And then the blue arrows is really these, we call them master use cases, that ties together all the aspects of the tool landscape into something coherent and efficient. We call that the factory for the digital enterprise. And really, and we've tested out that, is that it can unify this concept. I need speed, I need agility, I need security, and I need insight in what is going on. So that's the big picture stuff on what you really need to do. Now, when you signed up for this webinar, you said, okay, I want to learn about monitoring for as code and how to do that in Micro Focus tools, and we'll come to that in a minute. It fits into this bigger picture. Now I'll concentrate down into what is needed for monitoring for code. Well, I lied. I want to say that, yes, if you're going to do Micro Focus, we actually do have products for all of the aspects of this landscape. Again, we'll double down on really just 2, maybe 3 products in the coming slides. The first one is to recognize that when it comes to DevOps and monitoring as code, it's not all of these master use cases, all of these blue arrows that are relevant. It's actually one that is the primary one, and that's the continuous deployment one, where you accelerate how you deliver stuff into production. There's also the feedback loop that gives you increased service reliability, and obviously the continuous deployment is fed by a continuous build and test loop. And there is some exploration going on that's important for DevOps to be efficient, but we can ignore that safely here. So if you go down to the accelerate delivery, it's really coming from you build stuff, you release it, you fulfill it, deploy it, and then you make sure that assurance, that's the last box there in the arrow, is actually also fulfilled, so that you design your monitoring as code, and then you actually push it all the way into the assurance functionality of your factory. Okay. There is another way of looking at that and saying, well, how can we establish that? Well, there are actually fundamentally 2 different ways of doing it. One is that you establish a factory team that defines how this should be done for all the dev and ops and DevOps teams in your organization. But you can also start in a somewhat simpler way, by basically accepting the fact that like 90% of the organizations today is that development is separate from operations. You have very qualified, smart operations teams that understands how to do operations at scale. And that team would then become a business partner for the development. So instead of development working just with the lines of business, developing new applications, they would also talk to the operations team about saying, well, what is the target, not just the target platforms it's to be deployed on, they typically do talk about that, but also what is the target monitoring and operations environment that it needs to go into. And there, it's important that the operations team actually have a qualified answer. And in our case, we would say, well, this functionality of doing fulfillment, that is the way that you take a release and fulfill it or deploy it into operations, into something that is sure that you have a standardized way of doing that. And in Micro Focus, that is based on the hybrid cloud management toolset. And that toolset is integrated with the CMDB and the operations bridge of the landscape, so that if you use it, it's easy to ensure that you actually create the templates needed to deploy not only into your data center, but also into your assurance operations with Operations Bridge, that you understand what you deployed in the bigger scheme of things with the CMDB. And also potentially that you have the integrations with service management so that you can push to incidents, and incidents can be pushed back to the development side. And our proposal for development side is ALM Octane. We'll not talk about that in detail here. Again, the primary focus today will be on the hybrid cloud management operations bridge part. The other products can be swapped out with competitor products we have. It will still work. The architecture and the principles are the same. So really, monitoring as code is a way of starting to achieve DevOps without it being dev that takes the rest of the organization as hostage. And really, it is done in a three-layer way. At the basis, you create a factory for monitoring, right? The next layer up, you create a common framework for defining the monitors that would run on that fabric. And at the top level, the development will take those requirements and actually define the monitorings and code the monitoring to be deployed through the framework into the factory for monitoring. Right. So let's start discussing that in practice. How can we do it with our product portfolio? So with that, I will hand it over to Michael to take it away.
Thank you, Lars. Oops, okay. Okay, so now we're going to look at how this is done with Micro Focus tools, and I'm going to give you a quick overview. So basically, as Lars said, Dev creates the code, and the next step is that HCMX, and I'll just mention that HCMX is a brand new product. It just came out this month. And I have Alex from our product marketing team. He's one of my teammates. He's in the session, so if you've got detailed questions about HCMX, he'll be able to answer that. You can do the same thing with HCM. I just thought, well, as long as we came out with a new product, I might as well mention it. So the screenshots that you're going to see are going to be of HCMX. But again, you can do this with HCM, Hybrid Cloud Management, and that's been available for a while. So HCMX is going to do the deployment, and OpsBridge is going to monitor the situation. So that's the setup process. We'll go through that in detail. And then what happens when you've got an instance of data that you actually want to get into the system? Well, your app is going to send data to the agent. The agent's going to take that data, and OpsBridge is going to display that data. So that's the context at which everything I'm going to do next applies. All right, so there's a fair chunk of administrative tasks that need to get done. So the first thing is, whoever the dev lead is going to work with an HCMX designer, again, or HCM, and they're going to model your application and put in all the components that are needed. You're probably going to need a database. You may need a load balancer. So anyhow, all of the things that you need are going to be put into a design that'll look something like this. And you can see I've put in a big X for where the monitoring is going to be set up. You're going to define parameters. So I guess I should back up and say, what's the value of using a tool like HCM or HCMX? And it is that you get to define once how you want an application built. It can be parameterized, as you can see here, and it can be applied to multiple platforms. So if you want to deploy this to AWS and then decide AWS is not working for you, you can then switch it over to, say, Azure. So anyhow, as part of the design, the monitoring will be in here, and we're going to see how all these things are selected later on. Then for each of the items that you want work done, operations orchestration is included with HCMS. And just to be clear about it, it's not all of the operations orchestration product for any use case. It is limited to the use cases and nodes that HCM is using. But anyhow, you set up each one of these workflows, and these are the things that get kicked off with the parameters that you specified in the last screen to actually do the setup. So, you know, upload your AWS image, activate it. Specifically, what we're interested in is starting monitoring. Okay, and then finally, you end up creating a catalog that has the items that you want a developer to be able to select so that they can get their application running on the target service platform. And by the way, this could be a private cloud as well. So what are some of the associated tasks that you do? So the first one is pretty much mandatory. If you're going to use OBM to do the monitoring, and just to back up mention on that, OBM is part of OpsBridge. It's sort of the core of OpsBridge. If it's going to do monitoring, you need to set up a monitoring policy to tell it what it is you want it to monitor, and the service discovery. So this will say, these are the things I want you to monitor. These are the displays I want you to associate with that monitoring. But you also have the option of setting up business process monitoring, which is our synthetic monitoring tool. If you want to do that, this would be a case where dev or test would write scripts in LoadRunner, which is one of our testing tools. Those scripts would be recorded, and then those scripts would be, loaded into BPM. So the same thing that test is testing, operations now has the capability to run those same tests, which means when there's a failure, you can push that back to dev and say, look, here's exactly the test that this failed on, and that's obviously very useful. It also means that operations can tweak those scripts or write their own scripts when they find failures and send those scripts back to test so that they can put that in their test suite, and so that that failure isn't going to happen anymore because it'll be caught then. And then that script will be activated with an API via APM. Additionally, you could use Real User Monitor, and for that, you just simply need to create an XML configuration and get that uploaded. And this would be for any specific protocols that you're using that are not one of the standard ones that RUM has in its out-of-the-box capability. So now we've got the general capability to monitor. We can do synthetic monitoring, and we can use Real User Monitoring. And then, as you'll see, you can have access to all of that. Okay, so we've done all the setup now. And now let's see what the average developer is going to have to do once all that setup is done to actually get their application going. So first, they're going to see this catalog, which we had developed previously, and they're simply going to hit a request service button. They will get a form to fill out, and this second screen is probably the most important, where they can pick the parameters, so how many servers they want. This is also where they would select the monitoring that they want. So this is where you set up your monitoring parameters. The next thing is they're going to get an email, as any good product would do, saying, hey, guess what? What you requested was successfully created or not. And if it wasn't, obviously you go back and fix it. Was successfully created, and the implication here is, I'm working on it for you. and I'll let you know when it's done, which is the second email that you get, which is the solution has been provided, and you can now go accept the solution or not. And that takes you back to the portal where you can look over what was done. You can modify, cancel the service, and this can be done later as well. But if you wanted to change something, you could do it right here. And then you either accept if everything's correct, or you reject with your changes. And boom, you're done.
And just to add, Michael, on this one is that developers to some degree hate GUIs and other people's systems, but we can integrate that with ChatOps, so that fundamentally the standard chat channels that developers typically are using, that they can make a lot of these requests and answers through a chat dialogue. And for especially trying to move left and shift left into development, that's an extra feature that is available. We don't demonstrate it here though.
Yep. Thanks, Lars. Good point. Okay, so let's look at what's happening behind the scenes. So HCMX and OO have deployed the application, and so it's now up and running. And HCMX also tells Operations Bridge Manager to discover the app. So it goes out and discovers the app. And one of the things that happens automatically is that discovered app is put into OpsBridge Real-Time Service Manager. Now, Real-Time Service Manager, and I didn't put it in here, can be synchronized to our CMDB product, Universal CMDB. So not only will Operations Bridge have that data, but it can also be put so that any person who deals with the UCMDB, so for example, anybody wanting to do asset management, et cetera, can track that. And then Operations Bridge, obviously, now that it's done the discovery, that's one of the things about OpsBridge is once it discovers something, it will grab the policy and automatically start monitoring it. So boom, your monitoring has started. So now let's take a look at, as I said, basically, where an instance of data needs to be sent over. So the application sends data to the operations agent. The operations agent grabs that data and forwards it to OpsBridge, which will process the data. Now, one may ask, why do it this way? And we've got, oddly, 25 years of experience in getting reliable connections between agents and servers, because the number of possible ways that an agent might have to run through hoops to get to OpsBridge is quite high. There could be firewalls in place. The agent could be in the cloud, which it most likely would be in this case, whether it be public or private. It's interesting. We've had customers actually try to build their own agents and keep running through the same set of problems that we'd already solved. And a number of them finally just gave up and said, we'll use your agent. So anyhow, OpsBridge just processed that data, and voila, you get a display. And these displays are configurable, so you can define whatever display you want. I'm going to show you some of that in just a moment, but I want to just talk about some optional things that you can do. So if a problem is found, you can have automated remediation, which OpsBridge Ultimate includes a piece of OO as well. OO is very popular, and it can automatically remediate that problem. And this is something that the operations team would do. So when a known problem comes in, they can right-click on an event and get a list of possible remediations that they can run. And this is something that dev and senior operations and SMEs have determined are safe for operators to use. Next is you could have OpsBridge report the issue into an ITSM tool. So we have a process we call CLIP, closed closed loop incident management, where issues, basically an operator can bring up a form where they can put in some comments, push a button, and it automatically gets sent to an ITSM system. That could be ours, that could be, we support a number of third-party ITSM systems. And the beauty of that is, oh, and then this would go to the dev backlog. But the other beauty of this is that if the operations team is able to solve the problem, they can close it on their end, and it will automatically tell the ITSM system, hey, this is closed. Conversely, if this ends up, say, going to the developer, and the developer ends up closing the ticket, boom, the event is automatically closed in Operations Bridge, so the operations team knows that this is solved. And then additionally, you have the option of pushing it to a chat channel, so that if this is the way the dev team is monitoring what's going on, boom, they'll see the fact that this problem had occurred. And the great thing about this for the developer is they don't have to worry about trying to monitor this stuff 24/7. The operations team will do that, but dev has access to all this data on demand. And I'll just tell a little story about this. So for one of our customers, the dev team, put the monitoring in the bits, and they were sending the data to tools that they had got. And eventually they got tired of this 24/7 thing, getting paged in the middle of the night with a problem. And so they took the monitoring tools over to the operations team and said, we've got these operation monitoring tools. I was wondering, could you take this over so that you can do the 24/7 monitoring? And the head of operations said, no, I'm not putting my team through having to learn a bunch of other tools and monitor them. Why don't you just send your data to the tool I've already have in place and is working just fine? And ultimately, that's what they did, is sent the data to Operations Bridge. So I said I'd go through these screens in a little more detail. So here's a blow up of the screen that I just showed. And I mentioned that, once OpsBridge discovers the app, that data will go into RTSM. And you can see here on the upper right, we've got the topology of the application, because not only does RTSM discover the application, but discovers all the pieces that are used in the infrastructure for that app. This is another real benefit for dev, because your app, let's say that there's a database that you're using, you need to make some calls to that or use it somehow, and it has the problem. Well, it's got a problem, and most likely that's going to cause a problem in your app, which you may have instrumented monitoring for. So not only is the database throwing a problem, but your app is throwing a problem. And one of the things that Operations Bridge does really well is event correlation. So based on a diagram like this, Operations Bridge is going to look and say, I'm getting a problem from a database, and that database happens to be servicing this application code. So looking at the two errors, I'm betting that the problem is the database, not the application. And that will be the root cause shown to operations, not your application. So operations will go off and fix the database problem, and voila, it doesn't get back to you that your application had a problem, even though your instrumentation was showing that that was the case. Now, you could look at that because we show both root cause and symptoms. It's just that when we display those to operators, they're nested and hidden unless they actually want to see them. So as I said, the displays can take lots of different forms. Here we have a screen that shows a combination of infrastructure metrics, network metrics, and application performance metrics. So in our standard configurations, these would come either from site scope or operations agents. This would come from a network node manager, but it could be a third-party networking tool. And application performance would most likely come from our business process monitoring or real user monitoring, but again, could come from a third-party tool. One of the things about Micro Focus is we are not a you have to rip and replace organization. Use the tools that make sense for you, and we will integrate those. We support over 200 tools and technologies integrations. So your applicant, but the net point of it is you could build a display like this, or for that matter, build a display for anything that you happen to want. You could build a display that only showed the things that you had instrumented. Okay, so this is the API that the agent uses. So you have the options of adding counters, gauges. You can give it attributes that you want to displayed or just general strings. And the documentation for this is at this URL, which is here, and also at the end of in my last resources slide. So, putting this all together in summary, you define a common base for monitoring. In this case, we've talked about using Operations Bridge. You define a framework for putting all this together. That's HCMX. Again, you could use HCM. Dev and monitoring partner together to build the service models and the OO scripts, which actually turn all this into actionable reality. So with that, you'll get the slide deck. I think Ron mentioned that, and here are a whole set of resources that you can use. This whole process, interestingly, started with this article at the top, which Lars wrote, and Ron saw the article and said, hey, this is great. And internally, so this article shows up on Tech Beacon, which is our basically our news and educational site. And the editor who put this up said, hey, Michael, Lars has written this nice, very general article on how DevOps works. Could you make that more real? And so I wrote a blog on how, which is basically what I've just presented, how to use ITOM tools to actually execute all that. I mentioned the agent stuff. So the second blog is an article written by Carol Park, one of our ambassadors, on how to use Perl to visualize in custom monitored metrics into OBM. So that's a good read if you want to go off and do this. And then I have the web pages for the three products, and the again the documentation page for the APIs to the agent, so you can put your data in. So with that, we will take questions. And Ron, I think I'm turning it back over to you for soliciting questions.
And actually, it's Rocky.
Sorry, Rocky, it's to you.
Yes, sir. Great job on the explanation of how OpsBridge comes into the fold here and how the different components work. That was great. We've got a few questions, and one kind of goes back to the discussion you were having around, developers' approach to, working off the command line as opposed to the GUI. And the question kind of goes like, and again, I'm not sure if this is an acronym or a real word, YAML dash or cloud slang be used in integrating the application delivery into the chain so that it is automated. Not sure if you understood that question, but
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and yes, it is the word YAML. It's an acronym, yet another markup language. But anyway, and Cloud Slang is defined in YAML, and that's you could call it a text version of operations orchestration. So yes, you can do that, and that's exactly. And so it's a very good question, because it really goes towards the fact that developers they hate GUIs, they love the command line. I made a note on it also earlier to Michael's demonstration of the GUIs, is that we integrate also with the chat ops concept, that you have a chat channel that all the machines you interact with are also displaying to. But yes, the developers can develop these scripts in Cloud Slang and attach them to the service model. The service model itself is really something that you edit as a GUI construct. You can store it in a controlled versioned manner, like developers want to do, and then you associate these scripts to it. And then of course there is other kinds of scripts, the Perl scripts, the XMLs, etc., that you would push as part of the package, and that's classical development associated. So good question, and short answer is yes.
Great. Here's another one. Can you guys talk to how diagnostics has the ability to stack trace and then kind of give that data back to the developer?
Sure. So diagnostics is one of the tools in our APM suite, and I didn't happen to mention it, but certainly it is another monitoring tool that could be activated as part of this process. As mentioned in the question, what it does is stack traces, and it can tell you things like which module in your code is taking the longest to run, and provide that data back. And yes, all that data will be in OBM, and OBM will be able, to display that back, or you could go directly into a diagnostics interface and see it there.
Okay, great. Michael, I've got a question for you that may be outdated, but I've always was curious about the migration from Operations Manager to OpsBridge and how customers are using it today. I mean, was the migration smooth? Did it take extra education to figure out how to leverage the tool? I know it's still agent-based like we had from day one of these products, but just trying to get a sense of how the community has accepted the migration to leveraging the OpsBridge tools.
Yeah, so a majority of our customers, by the way, the whole Operations Manager, Operations Bridge product line celebrated its 30th anniversary a little while back. So it's been around for a long time. But anyhow, I would say the majority of our customers have moved. And the first move was from Operations Manager to OMI. And OMI originally was its own little product. And that migration, by the way, is free. You get a license entitlement. If you had Operations Manager, you get a license entitlement to OMI or now to OpsBridge. So Operations Bridge is basically OMI, which has now been renamed into Operations Bridge Manager so that it could match all the other products that sit in the Operations Bridge suite, like Operations Bridge Analytics and Operations Bridge Reporter. So you did start over when you moved from Operations Manager to Operations Manager I. However, Operations Manager I, like Operations Manager, is a manager of managers. So one of the things that many of our customers did was they just kept their Operations Manager tools running and used Operations Manager I as a manager of manager and took all of the additional features that OMI had has, and put those to use over time. So in the beginning, you just I've got all these operations managers, I'll just feed those up. I get some new displays that have some new capabilities, and then I can start incrementally adding on the other new capabilities. So whether you went to OMI or whether you just did this recently and went directly to OpsBridge and got yet more capabilities that were added on top of OMI. OMI is still the core, but we've added other capabilities around it. So anyhow, it's that's kind of how things went. And then some people decided that, okay, now that I'm familiar with what OMI can do, and given that operations manager is getting a little long in the tooth, I will just switch those operations manager installations over to OMI, or just get rid of them and take the agents that they were dealing with and send that data directly into OMI. So hopefully that answered your question. Long answer,
great.
but
no, I needed a long answer because I know that there was, like with any change, people just don't want to change, and there's a learning curve involved. But if you want to leverage the newer technologies, you've got to go to the newer platforms. And speaking about that, since we're an APM SIG, we had at one time, API, or I'm sorry, the OpsBridge I product was tied in with the application performance tools, and then I think they were split out during the process. So what is the strategy there? Are we leveraging the former Mercury tools, I guess?
oh yeah. So that was, this is just one of those organizational things. So originally, APM, BPM, diagnostics were all part of the ITOM organization, so the operations management organization.
Right.
And somebody decided, no, those tools really belong over with application development management. So those tools were moved over there. And then 2 years ago, they decided, no, you know what, we had it right to begin with, so we're going to move them back. So one of the things we just did is we changed the licensing for Operations Bridge. And you'll see how this applies. So we now have this thing called unit licensing. So you buy units and you apply units as you wish. You can apply those units to agents. You can apply those units to SiteScope. You can apply those units to APM, BPM, RUM, diagnostics. And the beauty of this is we don't care where you use those units. And you can make the change anytime you want. So for example, if you had a facility that had a BPM probe in it, and that facility, you decide, well, I don't need this facility anymore, and that BPM probe goes away, you can take the points that you were using for that BPM probe and, for example, say, I want to use them for RUM, or I want to use them for diagnostics, or I want to use them for agents or SiteScope. So, and you don't have to call us up. I've got the points. I switch it over. So that's the strategy. And you saw in the one screen that I showed where I had application performance data along with network data, along with system data. So our strategy is that basically OBM will become the Uber manager of all those products. And it's the way you're going to ultimately visualize all that data. And so if all you wanted to do, for example, was application monitoring stuff, you'd have a screen managed by OBM, taking data from all those tools and showing you the results.
Right.
So just to kind of add it differently, to say, yes, in the past, we had a lot of different products. Essentially what we're moving towards, and we're pretty much home safe now on that move, is that it's all about modules that you can enable and disable depending on your needs, right? And so now it's even reflected in the pricing structure, saying, well, you just get you buy a certain amount of capacity for monitoring, but you enable the module that makes sense for you in any given situation, and it should be as seamless as possible to enable whatever is relevant. And then the other thing around saying they're moving back and forth application monitoring versus infrastructure monitoring, etc. Well, no, we are moving towards everything as code, right? Develop works with operations, infrastructure, and applications. That's just different layers, but it's still code that needs to run, right? So that's how we are moving forward.
Great. Appreciate the answer.
Much better job, Lars.
I dumbed it down. Sorry.
Here's something that's come in. What are the additional skills required for developers to incorporate the monitoring code into the original code?
Right. That's a good question, because while you could say, well, it's part of the life of a developer to constantly understand new things, right? You get in, you getting asked to develop something, and then you start from scratch and figure out how to do it, right? And so that's the same with monitoring. Fundamentally, if you ask developers and say, can you please build in monitoring to that, then their next question will be, well, what do you mean by that? What kind of monitoring? And then you need to develop those use cases and get that understanding done of what does it mean to actually monitor a product. Just like if it was, say, an account receivable module to an SAP system he was asked or she was asked to develop, then the developers need to be asking question and get specified. What does that really mean, right? Hopefully, after you've done one or two iterations with development, they start actually have well-documented sets of saying, well, this is how we do monitoring in our organization. The core skills to doing it is just coding, right? If you use the Cloud Slam OO language, it's pretty simple to pick up. If you do it in YAML notation, then there is a notation style to that. If you use the user GUI for it, it's pretty straightforward, intuitive. So we don't have any issues in general with developers having a steep learning curve in figuring out to do that. The learning curve is for developers to understand what it means to monitor.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I don't think it's going to be a big leap, because already developers write log entries, right? That's a pretty common part of the
Sure.
development process is, oh, I've got something I need to report. And in one context, it's just, well, what you would have done in a log file, you can probably package into an intelligent message and send it over to the monitoring tool.
Okay.
And that goes hand in hand also with test development, right? So you have various ways of testing if things is going right or wrong in the development cycle, saying, well, maybe all of these tests is actually relevant for the production side. We didn't touch about that in detail here, but the concept of saying the performance testing, load testing is a non-functional developers need to do. But these scripts can also be reused over in the monitoring side to monitor is the performance okay or not okay, right? So there is that natural affinity.
Great. We've got a nice one for you here from Keith. What is the state of the industry with application instrumentation? Should developers be expected to create and maintain synthetic monitoring? What about JavaScript in the browser? What's the trade-off between deep dive instrumentation versus effort to create and maintain instrumentation? So looks like a bunch of questions tied to the same thing.
Yeah, no, I think we should have a webinar on that. It is a very comprehensive question, but if we, and I'm tempted to state that the state of the industry is not very well defined. There are different sort of best practices happening, right? One school of thought is that, well, you should lock everything and just make sure you lock that into a common repository. Then you apply some machine learning, and then you figure out if stuff is good or bad, right? But once you start doing that, you realize that you're actually you are slowing down the process with all the logging you're doing, and the machine learning might not actually be as good as you like it to be. So increasingly we see this pattern emerge in that there is latent logging code, and then you can in production turn it up and down depending on how much you suspect modules to be under stress or having issues, right? But actually finding that balance is an art form, and good developers know how to do that. Bad developers have no clue, right? And that's another reason why the concept of DevOps actually is important, because then if developers get the responsibility of fixing stuff, they also automatically start developing and trimming how they do logging to really have sensible logging. If their problem is that the performance is bad, but they turn out it's because I'm doing too much logging, then okay, then they fix that part. So balancing that in a fast loop seems to be the path forward. The JavaScript in browsers, now we're getting into an entire other realm of challenges, and that's the monitoring at the client side, and I'm tempted to skip that question, that part of it. I'd be happy to have a discussion with Keith offline on it.
Great, thanks. That's probably all the time we have. I think we've answered most of the questions. If you've got any additional questions, send them to us, and we'll make sure that the team answers them, and will be in the recorded session that we'll send to everyone that attended or registered for this event. So thank you, Lars and Michael, for your presentation today. I'm moving on to Vivid activities. So upcoming events from a Vivid perspective: Tuesday, September 22nd, you'll see if you were part of the Florida LUG group, they're talking about ALM and some of the workflow customizations there. Also, there is a Operations Bridge event that you can click on our website, it looks like, or it's Micro Focus's community. So click on that to kind of learn more about what's happening with Ops Bridge. And again, Ron Franklin, who is our co-SIG leader for the APM SIG, and I, if you have topics that you want to hear more about, please send them to us. And if you're interested in being more involved in a Vivid SIG or LUG, which is a local user group, we're always looking for people that want to share their expertise and support the community they live in. Even though today it's all virtual, but at some point we'll get back to physical events, I hope soon, next year, where we can meet together face to face, learn from each other, share best practices, get the updates from the vendors and partners, and grow the community that you all have created as part of your career. So with that, Ron and I want to thank you for attending the event today, and have a great day.